Good morning. So, as Michael introduced, my research centers on defining the validity of pop art in Latin America, and by evaluating its nature within Western artistic canons and its applicability to a Latin American context. This study represents a gateway to important problematics that include folklore, political ideology, class divisions, and geopolitics, also in reference to the aesthetics of imported imperialist culture. The title of this paper quotes a poem by Haroldo de Campos, written for the catalogue on Mira Schendel of her 1966 exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in Rio. By defining her work as a semiotic art of icon, indexes, symbols, de Campos lists themes that were at the base of avant-garde practices in the 60s, implying a dialogue between her works and the cultural influences of the period, which included pop, or its derivations. When talking about pop, it's crucial to have an understanding of the historical context and the social climate of the areas that we're looking at. So in the past month, having looked at the work of Mira Schendel closely, I was asking myself questions such as how she was isolated somehow from specific cultural movements. Her work is seen as tangential and very unique in the Sao Paulo cultural milieu. So how did she inform her practice? Whose work influenced her, and how did she relate to the cultural situation at the time? So Brazil in the 1960s experienced an anticlimax of its developmentalist phase at the end of Kubitschek's presidency in 1961. In that year, 3 presidents were elected in the space of 9 months, which caused great public unrest, and President João Goulart, who was the president elected between 1961 and 1964, attempted to establish closer relations with other communist countries, therefore sort of shifting the political orientation of the country leftwards. And this eventually led to the military coup in 1964. In the situation of political turmoil and disillusionment combined with the Cold War, the industrialization of tourism, and the reshaping of the institution of colonialism, actually, sorry, I should have shown you this, which an amazing cover of Time magazine with Kubitschek's portrait, so the image of the 1950s Brazil as this booming and resurfacing country, and later the inauguration of Brasilia in 1960, and the sort of downfall of this whole dream. So Cold War and political tourism, the cultural, colonial institutions were being reshaped at the time and redefined, and Brazilian artists continued to dismantle a single idea of modernity, making way for alternative vernacular interpretations of what it meant to be modern. Keeping in mind Oswald de Andrade's core concept of cannibalism, Brazil continued to reshape its cultural identity through experimentalism and ideological exploration. In the words of Helio Tisica, given the real and chimerical nature of cultural identities, and here I quote, "There is no Brazil, only a plethora of Brazils." The issue of pop, therefore, relates to the complex political time as well as the fertile cultural environment that responded to technological advances and the development of avant-garde internationally. Paulo Herkenhoff, in his incomplete glossary of sources of Latin America, defines pop as paternalism, obscurantism, populism, and blind regionalism, listing as its catalysts anti-consumption, poverty, hunger, anti-communication, or countercultural circuits and counter-informational circuits, and censorship. Divided between Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, cultural movements in the 60s begin to experiment with issues behind the themes of consumption and authorship and participation, and the dematerialization of the art object. So, according to Sonia Salstein, Schendel was isolated, here I quote, isolated from noisy upfields of the cultural agenda of this time, unquote. There are contrasting depictions of Schendel's character, and although she is understood as a firm intellectual individual, a bibliophile, as Tanya introduced before, she's also depicted as a solitary artist concerned with the entropic, arbitrary, and brutal aspects of daily life. And she's sort of circumscribed direct confrontation in determined contexts, which could have been at her home with a Dominican theologian, or over the phone with Haroldo de Campos, or on Willem Flusser's terrace in Sao Paulo. Some even argue that she also suffered from agoraphobia, which sometimes may explain her alleged reclusiveness. The general consensus contextualizes Schendel's work as colloquial investigations that overcome the idiosyncrasies of personal drama and plunge into interiorization without ever falling into psychologizing. Her works subtly explore the limits of subjectivity without imposing personal marks that therefore enable the viewer's experience to remain pure and creatively active. Although this may all be true, it is important to reconsider Schendel's works as a part of a cultural moment and not in isolation from it. Between 1967 and 1963, it has been suggested that Schendel stopped producing art systematically as she did in her later years, so like this enormous production, daily production of art, and this was all due to the birth of her first daughter, or her own daughter Ada. It can be argued that if she had been, in fact, more reclusive in this period, she would have been faced in the 1963 or around that period with the issue of relocating herself within the Sao Paulo experimental art scene. So here's like a moment where she, again, relates to pop art because she is trying to understand the cultural scene at the time and place herself in dialogue or in communication with what was going on, but without being sort of a follower, without maintaining her very solid identity. So in those years, in 1963, 1964, Schendel started producing and experimenting with various techniques all simultaneously, which included minimalistic landscapes, still lives, constructive figurations, almost adopting a cannibalistic attitude toward arts production in such a short time. In the early 60s, there was a crisis in the so-called syntactic tendencies, which means kinetic, concrete arts, because of the influx of mass communication made possible by electronic media that paved the way towards a new pace in art. The concretists had dissolved in order to foster experimentation outside of a defined canon. Consistently with the climate, Schendel also operated a major shift in her painterly style from abstract figuration. Unlike her canvases from the 1950s that demonstrate a strong abstract modernist influence, reminiscent of Morandi, which is the painting on the left, in her new still life, Schendel experiments with seriality and reevaluates the spatial plane. However, if we look at this early example of her painting, which was 1954, the still life that still was very, sort of abstract figuratism is very domestic. There is that object is a shape for pastry, a spoon. So there's sort of like a very domesticity about it, and simplicity and flatness, sort of reminiscent of Morandi. So in the early 60s, there was sorry, I'm wrong. So a stronger sense of the void enters her aesthetics from the previous Morandian works, and the arbitrary proliferation of anonymous objects in her still lives enforces her symbolic power. So here, much in contrast with her previous works, the depiction becomes flatter, drained, sort of, and again, the appearance of words. For instance, the kaki, which is an orange fruit. And there is only one full one, and the rest is the seriality of repetition. And slowly sort of lose their bodiliness somehow. At this stage, I think that it's important to consider also how Schendel's work has been viewed as a whole, because it tends, maybe for a curatorial necessity mostly, it tends to be divided in series and sub-series. Well, maybe in this case, when looking at it as a cultural phenomenon, it's useful to see it as a stream of consciousness, as a continuum and as an investigation into her own problematics, which, without dividing it into series, and sort of being aware of her continuous production that was not necessarily limited to a single idea at a time, and so to a series at a time. Her work was not developed in isolation, and it was, I would like to stress the dialogue with the concretist tendencies in Sao Paulo and Europe, importantly through the work of Umberto Eco, Hermann Schmitz, Mario Schemberg, the Dominican priests, Willem Flusser, and also Guy Brett. Expressing her concerns in the mid-60s, Schendel writes, "My concern is with capturing the transfer," sorry, this was a quote, "the transfer of the instant living experience full of empirical vigor into the symbol imbued with memorability and relative eternity. I know that in fact I have a problem in that immediate life, i.e. the life I live within which I act, is solely incommunicably mine, and for this reason, senseless and without purpose. On the other hand, the realm of symbols, which seeks to seize this life, the realm of languages, in an anti-life, in the sense of being something intersubjective, ordinary, devoid of emotion and suffering. If only I could match these two realms, I would combine the richness of the living experience with the relative immortality of the symbol. In other words, my works would constitute an attempt to immortalize fleeting moments and confer meaning to ephemeral things." Unquote. This is another example of her still lives. So in terms of the progression from the more Morandian to the simple minimalistic. So these fruits, which you can see, represent a gradual step away from the figuration. And as in her written piece, the works aspire to an anti-life that becomes intersubjective and indexical, as alluded to by Geraldo de Campos. Here, the sort of two-dimensionality of the works and the liquid ink, as I said, drain them of their physicality and transfer them more to the symbolic realm. So the relationship with de Campos was, in fact, a crucial importance in Schendel's advance. De Campos, following his years with the Neugandres, the movement and journal he led with his brother Augusto and Decio Pignatari, and centered his practice of critic, translator, artist on concrete poetry, which he fathered in Sao Paulo. Umberto Eco's 1962 Opera Aperta considerably influenced his thought. De Campos's visual poetry elaborated on the semiotic power of words in relation to form, and he expanded his concept through his writing. So this is his 1965, the image I'm showing, a book that he published with his brother Augusto and Decio Pignatari, entitled The Theory of Concrete Poetry, that included essays and visual works and manifestos. The Neugandres were highly considered within the intellectual circles for their erudition, and they were instrumental in the construction of new tendencies after constructivism. Augusto de Campos, in his artistic practice, inserted a critique of popular culture and consumption, demonstrating openness to the changing pace of art production, as well as participating in subversive practices against the military regime. His 1965 work, Luxo Lixo, Luxury Trash in Portuguese, he appropriates the font used by estate agents in their advertisements. Here, Luxo Lixo is a critical and satirical juxtaposition directed at the abuse of real estate and the industrialization of tourism I mentioned before. again, there is a strong presence of humor, which is a constant also in Schendel's work, who maybe not as obviously in all of them, but retains an element of playfulness that transpires throughout her over. So the presence of concrete poetry under these terms demonstrates a growing concern with semiotics, symbolism, and consumption and critique which Schendel was being exposed to. An artist that exalted these issues was Valdemar Cordero, who had signed with Augusto and Haroldo de Campos and Disciplinatari, among others, the Ruptura Manifesto in 1952, and had actively participated in the concrete movement in the following years. With a background in modernist abstraction and distinguished by his polemic and intellectual personality, Cordero was deeply concerned by the impact of the telecommunications on the medium of art, and already during the concrete years was reflecting upon the role of participation. Throughout his practice, he questioned the relationship and value of art in urban industrial societies. In the 1960s, still in the aftermath of developmentalism, Cordero was in favor of utilitarian and collective art that would foster the development of a new society. In 1964, for an exhibition at the Atrium Gallery in Sao Paulo, Cordero exhibited the first of his works to be known as popcretos. The term popcreto was coined by Augusto de Campos to define the fusion between concrete art and pop. Cordero considered his pieces semantic concreticism that translated the art object from the sphere of production to the sphere of consumption using interactive communication. So this was one of his first popcrete works, and made of newspaper cuttings collaged to form a new newspaper page, where the notion of mutilation was applied. So mutilation to information in order to generate new meaning. So here you can almost read out were impostos, which is taxes, and revolution, and then in the bottom left, something that resembled communists. So there is a sort of not explicit but political critique. Well, quite explicit. So his focus, I'll continue. His focus on daily life materials, which included egg cartons, mirrors, enforced his connection to consumption and information exchange through new mediums. Here he applies the same concept of mutilating paper and information on objects. And so here he plays on norma all'abrasao, which has to do with abrasions, so this sort of physical pain from heat. And Cordero transformed the influence of concrete poetry and Derrida's semiotics into objects. His mutilation progressed from a syntactic concrete art to a semiotic concrete art. In the words of Anna Maria Belluzzo, quote, "A cubist painting executed with the scraps of consumer society." Other works include ready-made appropriations, including bicycle wheels, which are remnants of urban society and a tribute to Duchamp, or objects with political references, such as this one, that underline his political engagement while he progressively moved away from concretist dogmas. Humor, as I said before, is often forgotten, but it's important to remember that it was important also in order to get away with things. So it was often a strategy implemented by artists to make critique more subtle. Finally, Cordero is further contextualized by the participatory element present in his works. Rebolando, I'm sorry for the quality of the image, 1965, is an emblematic example. This work was refused at the 1965 Sao Paulo Biennial and consisted of a jug full of water with a photo of Marilyn Monroe lying on its bottom. So viewers were supposed to agitate the ball in order to get the photo to swirl and sort of see her better in a way through the neck of the jug. In this case, the viewer becomes the actualizador da obra, which means the enactor of the work, which also generated a sense of temporality where the viewer is invited to physically interact with the work and observe the outcome. Interestingly, this work was resubmitted and accepted at the following biennial in '67, considered in fact the Pop Biennial. In that same edition, Schendel participated with her Objetos Gráficos. Schendel's friendship with Haroldo de Campos and Mario Schemberg demonstrated through regular correspondence and interviews and her late-night phone calls, suggests that she was aware of the works and progress of concrete poetry, and also of Valdemar Cordero. Whilst introducing seriality in her drawings, like in The Fruits, and developing her works through the intimacy of still lives, Schendel also experiments with drawing and letraset, which relate to a growing necessity to explore the problematics of digital media in light of socio-cultural developments. The return of Achilles can be seen as the precursor of the 1970s dactyloscritos that are reminiscent of pop iconology, and may also mark Schendel's metaphorical return to art. This sense of the return of Achilles. There's an energy even in the title. The drawing is related to an oil painting which is untitled, brackets Achilles really, but it's referred to generally as Achilles. It did in 1964, that quotes a passage from Cardinal Newman's 1832 Lyra Apostolica, which is a text from the Oxford movement. There was a movement that criticizes the Church of England for its distance from the Vatican, basically. The passage reads, Froude, which is referred to Richard Hurrell Froude, a member of the Oxford movement, and myself at the time, we borrowed from M. Bergen, that again refers to Baron von Bergen, a Homer. He refers to the Iliad here. And Froude chose the words in which Achilles, returning to the battle, says, "You shall know the difference now that I am back again." Right, so return back again, this sort of emphasis. And this refers to the moment in the Iliad where the Trojans think Achilles is dead because Patroclus, Achilles' cousin, has substituted himself to Achilles in battle in order to supposedly kill Hector, but gets killed in the process. So Achilles sort of has this resurrection and comes back again. The first element to be noted is that this painting is supposed to be one of the first of Schendel's paintings with writing on it, representing a key philological moment in Schendel's aesthetic development. The monochromatic textured plane in the background is retained from her earlier works. However, the central sort of arch-shaped figure is reminiscent of a doorway, so somewhere, again, where energy crosses, and there is this sense of movement and return, and both the drawing and the painting. So I can just show the drawing again. And also, actually, I should point out that those sort of wheel structures also allude to some movement, some action, and the spear-like / anthropomorphic figure in the middle of the archway. Paired with the Hermetic sentence, the work explores a phenomenological realm that will later bloom in Monotypias and Objetos Gráficos. The notion of return suggests an energy to begin in a new battle. So again, I'd like to stress that. The letter set may suggest an engagement with new media beyond the paintbrush and the awareness of the aesthetics of pop art, or better, pop creto, which was precisely concerned with the necessities of a new urban society in the Sao Paulo cultural scene. So again, talking about the return, if we think about what I said before about Schendel's break, or supposed break, from the art scene between 58 and 63, this theme of energy, of renewed energy, may be consistent with that, and her desire with locating herself within the cultural scene, so finding her points of reference, so self-referential definitions. So, although aesthetically this work may be interpreted as referential to pop, it can be argued that its theological and classical content does not intertwine with popular culture, but rather establishes Schendel's philosophical and religious inquiries. So I think, although many have considered this to be a sort of pop influence in Schendel's oeuvre, I kind of feel like other works, including these, actually have a more powerful stance towards pop. So Sim and Che Bellezza, so Yes and How Beautiful, are from the same year and are described as spontaneous gestural recordings of Schendel's subjectivity. In fact, going back to the passage I quoted earlier, the artist searched for the intersubjective that would condense the impersonality of gesture into a universal language and her own personal experience. Sim and Che Bellezza allude to a quasi-tropicalist approach, to Brazilian life in an outburst of enthusiasm, which they share maybe with Achilles. The presence of color, which is rare in Schendel's most celebrated pieces, is emblematic of this sort of cultural involvement and also reveals an ironic political critique. Again, remembering the political climate of '64, what was going on. There, a president had just been deposed, and the coup was in process. So the presence of red, which also kind of reminds Cordero's earlier piece with the hammer, suggests political engagement. Although not entirely apparent through her practice, Schendel was described, in fact, by Pérez Aramis as generously rebellious, and this is a quote, due to the letters that she had sent to newspapers in the 50s, lamenting the bureaucratic disadvantages for refugees and émigrés, and her involvement with refugee organizations in Rome before she moved to Brazil. So her swift mark also, that this quickness in her producing these works, may relate to the de-fetishization of the artwork. So the pace which Schendel was producing favored a democratization of the artwork, so a popularization of the medium that may relate to Brazilian understanding of pop. At this point, we reach her lesser-known works that I had a chance to explore in the occasion of this conference, which belong to unpublished sets of watercolors from '64-65 and a travel sketchbook from '66. These works, unlike her monotypias, for instance, do not demonstrate the symptoms of scripture, but rather show a more awareness of the symbol and of the symbolic. So her figurative representations of ordinary and everyday objects and events refer to an immediacy of experience rather than an intimate feeling with these objects, much like the immediacy conveyed by Sim and Che Bellezza. These watercolors are almost investigations into the common, the everyday, into the realm, and here I quote Schendel again, the realm of symbols which seeks to seize this life, unquote. So the symbolic and lexical to which the campus refers. So these, again, are very bidimensional objects that, although these relate more to her work, instead of being this, they're still in the domestic realm. There is that intimacy of the domesticity of the objects. But, for example, aguaraz mineral is sort of a play on word on mineral water, and turpentine, I think the word in English is, or white spirit, maybe. Which is something that used to dilute oil paint. So again, this, and she starts for the first time paying attention to labels, which is interesting. The watercolor on the top, you can't really read what they are, but again, she pays attention to the actual branding of the works. So in her collages. Actually, no, I'll just show you the next one as well. So this one also, sort of domestic, much more colorful, has disinfectant and ketchup on it, and fish ketchup, which I'm not sure exactly what it is. We can move on. This is another very interesting one, where there is this sort of personal, there's a radio, pack of tobacco, her ochre, and her paintbrush, and then the theme of the daisy, or the colour of the flower, which is picked up in some of her oil paintings as well. And again, here, the sort of attention to branding, and there's this sort of connection to, to what is going on, what is the symbolism of the radio, so it's communication, being part of a society, and in a moment where, she's smoking, she's painting, she's listening to all these information. So there is a sense of sort of being part of a milieu. So in her collages, Schendel also reappropriates cutouts from magazines and newspapers, applying the amputation that common to Cordero. And so she rearranges symbols, much like Cordero did with objects. The first collage has this sort of wheel structure, which connects back to the Achilles drawing, and is a reflection, may be interpreted as a reflection of consumer society. So there is this sort of occulted images, and then the isolation of the little pocket watch as that sort of in the surrounding void, which may sort of suggest the imminence and the impossibility to go against this sort of cycle of time and objects. So this second collage I'm going to show is overcrowding of liquor bottles, and this time she doesn't only paint the labels, she actually just cuts them out and reuses them, again with superimposing it with her own drawing. And there is this sense of crowdedness, and sort of she puts at stake a very solid, a really consistent critique of consumption in this sense of alcohol. So popular culture and imagery become themes again. Like in Cordero, Schendel reconstructs a reality of fragments that resonate with an awareness of herbal industrial imagery. So the sketchbook that I'm going to look at was produced in 1966 during Schendel's travels to Europe for a show at the Signals Gallery, which we discussed yesterday. And it was the first time that Schendel had traveled back to Europe since her emigration in 1949. And the greater part of the sketchbook, you can almost make it out on the left page, was drawn in Paris, although it looks at London. It was so she managed to process her impressions of London only when she had left and was in Paris, which is interesting about her interaction with the city. And throughout the book, there is a distinct sense of an awareness of the different atmosphere in Europe as opposed to Brazil. In a letter to the painter Jorge Guinle Filo, which I'm not sure I'm pronouncing well, Schendel writes about her sense of the, I quote, ebullient changing time, unquote, and of a, quote, totally different climate, unquote, to the one in Rio, because she had just exhibited in Brazil. And the opening was very quiet, as opposed to the very crowded one that we can see here, a drawing of in London. So her drawing of the event is colourful, exciting, full of people, and gives a sense of her fascination with the London buzz. And the whole notebook displays her constant introspection, sort of the reflections that she comes up with through her trip. For example, here there is the Li Mira. She's probably referring to Li Wenxia, who she was the Chinese artist who she had become acquainted with in London because he spoke Italian, so they could, in the Signals Gallery, he was sort of her friend, I suppose. And some other pages remind us of, these again are from the London, so the theatricality, so she's sort of absorbing, again, the culture and trying to elaborate it. And some of her works, like the one on the left, might remind us of sort of a monotipia aesthetic. And and these sort of symptomatic phrases that are barely legible. This one reads, il sedno la morte, repeated until la morte is in reason and death, until death remains outside this Venn diagram, sort of, again, kind of like the clock in her collages. So the last images I'm going to show are drawings from the 1980s. So here are just another few that sort of show her theological concerns. And the one on the left is on when she was going from Switzerland to Italy through the Gotthard Pass, which shows the sort of peace of mind and the nature and the relaxation. And the one on the left is the eye. The eye is the profound mystery, and Wittgenstein Lee, which may refer to Lee Wanxia once again. So the last images I'm going to show are drawings from the 1980s that once again pick up on the theme of fruit, looked at in the early 60s, almost 2 decades after. Here, instead of sort of having these fruits on a plane, she, again, drains them even more of their three-dimensionality and suspends them into space. So the line at the bottom of the drawing is a strategy to despatialize the fruit. And the viewer no longer has sort of a term of reference to place himself. So it sort of the symbolic essence of the fruits remains purer. So at the and I had another image, and this is, you can't very much see it, Dati lo scritto, which again is one of her later works, which reminds us of sort of pop imagery, I guess, and her sort of sums up the entire influence that all this culture, this very buzzing culture she was immersed in, had on her practice. So at the beginning of my PhD, which I am now, I'm exploring the definition of pop art in Latin America and the delicacy of labeling any artist as pop. Although Schendel does not belong to the category of pop artist or any other category for that matter, her works demonstrate a constant awareness of the dialectics of the semiology, iconography, and symbolism, and also of the presence of media imagery and imported imperialist culture in Brazil. Here, desire for dialogue and discussion, combined with her bibliophilia and her thirst for philosophical investigations, breached through her perceived isolation from other defined movements, in this case, the exploration of pop as valuable metaphor that slices through the activity of artists, forcing a thorough understanding of social and cultural influences that generate the artwork and a continuous questioning of the position that they may occupy. Thank you.